My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of New America Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you here very briefly to tonight's formal programming. At New America, we often think deep thoughts about important subjects like debt ratios and disruptive emerging technologies and energy policy, and mercifully we're not going to do much of that tonight at all. So those of you who have participated in the forecasting contest or just partaken of the free alcohol, I welcome you. And I hope that this will be stimulating and fun and provocative, and that we might all learn something. I know from the people on the stage that's always the case when they just speak their minds. Just before I introduce them, a couple of housekeeping notes. Although C-SPAN is not here, inexplicably, there is nonetheless a camera. And so this is on the record and being recorded. So if there comes a time when Andres turns to the audience for questions, please wait for the microphone and recognize that your words are being recorded for immortality. And so be careful about what you say, especially those of you who have been drinking. And on that note as well, this was meant as much to start the new year and to celebrate the new year at New America, especially with the Fellows Program that Andres leads, about which I want to say a word or two, and to get people we like together and around a good conversation. And to that end, the formal part of this program, which will go on now for the next sort of 45 or 50 minutes, is not the end of the evening. So as it winds down, you can feel free to stay until 8 or beyond, as long as the bar lasts there, or until Andres tells you to leave. Anyway, he's in charge of calling time tonight. Andres Martinez has been at New America, I guess, now for 2 years-ish. We've both been here about the same time, yeah. And he directs our Bernard Schwartz Fellows Program and does a terrific job, in part because of his gift for putting people and ideas and alcohol together. And he has done a terrific job of restructuring the program and recruiting generations of new fellows who really speak to our aspirations, which is to try to bring forward really important new voices and talent with an eye toward next generation subjects and next generation sensibilities. We all, I think, have occasion to travel outside of Washington, and in virtually any sphere that you do that, you're reminded how disconnected the city can be from the pace of change that's going on in the country, some of it positive and some of it not. But the idea of our Fellows Program, which is really the sort of core DNA writing part of our shop here, is to try to provoke us and force us to reckon with those subjects that are not incremental in Washington. This is a town that will pull you into the incremental no matter how hard you resist it. And part of what Andres' mission is to insist that on discourse and talent and ideas and work that is not incremental. And I think he's done a terrific job. And in Megan and Peter, two of the brightest people that we're fortunate to be around here, both deeply serious, I think, and very sort of empirical and thoughtful about the work they do, but also unexpected and terrific writers and communicators and thinkers, and not afraid to provoke and to think over the horizon in big ways. And I hope, both looking back on the 10 years, I'm glad this picture has frozen, because we were saying as we were standing here that moment, which some of you will recognize as, was it Gerald Levin and Steve Case celebrating AOL's purchase of Time Warner with its inflated stock on the morning of 2000. That feels longer ago in cultural history even than 9/11. I mean, it really does. Just amazing. And so 10 years is a long time. It has been a lost decade for a lot of Americans in a lot of different ways. But I will not try to step on your themes by reflecting on that. So with that, welcome to Andres, and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Thank you. Just emergency. Thank you all for coming, and I hope we all can be reflective about the decade that was that we still haven't quite figured out what to call. But also, as Steve mentioned, there were some sheets as you walked in. We thought it'd be fun also to look forward, and so we have a little forecasting quiz. And if you missed it on the way in, you can fill one of these on the way out. So there are 10 multiple choice questions. The tiebreaker is you have to pick where the S&P 500 will be at the end of the year. And depending on how that S&P and other events unfold this year, the grand prize will be determined at the end of the year. We're going to give out a dinner, but how nice a restaurant will depend on how things go this year. So stay tuned. Also, you'll get a season pass to all New America events. So, second prize 2 years. No, and I should say there's actually breaking news on one of these questions because one of them is where will Conan O'Brien be working at the end of 2010? And he announced late this afternoon that the Tonight Show at 12:05 a.m. is not the Tonight Show. So, I think he's pretty peeved. And there's just one other question I wanted to mention. We ask which I country will receive the most mentions in the print edition of the New York Times in 2010? Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Italy. And some people might think that Italy is kind of a filler, but think about the travel section, dining, the arts. So I'm going with Italy. Anyways, I'm thrilled to be here with Peter Beinart. Many of you know is the former editor of The New Republic, writes for Time Magazine, The Daily Beast. He's here to represent Hubris tonight. He has a book coming out next summer on the role of hubris in American foreign policy. Yeah, this coming summer.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
And Megan McArdle is the business and economics editor at The Atlantic, also a New America Fellow. And Megan is here to represent failure. She's one of the most successful public intellectuals around, but she has a lot of profound thoughts about failure, the F word, as she calls it, as a comparative advantage in America, and the fact that our society allows people to fail. And that's one of the things that distinguishes us. And I agree with Steve that this picture is very apropos. And thank you to Faith Smith for putting together this great slideshow. I was looking at some of the photos when we were having cocktails, and I kept thinking, that really happened this past decade? It was a pretty brutal decade in many ways. And it's hard, particularly domestically, and we can talk about the disconnect, if there was one, between what this decade represented for the United States as opposed to other parts of the world. There's been a lot of good writing on that recently. But if you look back to this moment in time, which was really kind of captured the sort of millennial milestone exuberance. I mean, we were partying like it was 1999. This spilled over into 2000, the notion of AOL buying Time Warner. But it's almost hard to kind of put ourselves back in that moment of time. Had we, I feel like 10 years ago, a lot of us here would be whining that we don't have stock options, and when is New America going to have its IPO? And now, we're just grateful to have jobs. But, I think when I look back on the 90s, a lot of the kind of common thread seemed to be the hubris that we were conquering the very concept of risk. The new economy had made the business cycle anachronistic. We fought this war in the Balkans with hardly any casualties, so we'd sort of taken casualties out of wartime equation. You had, things like Viagra took out had made, sexual impotence for men an anachronism. And on. You can pick any subject, and there was this kind of notion that, there was nothing we couldn't conquer. And risk itself was kind of being redefined, and again, Exhibit A. So I want to start with the notion, and then, of course, fast forward to this past decade, and, it was a real reawakening and a reassessment of what risk entailed. And when you think about the number of hits that the United States took, and the sort of brand America, if you want to consider it that, starting with the Bush v. Gore meltdown in 2000, the Enron, WorldCom accounting scandals. I made a list because there were 6 of them. The 9/11 attacks, the botched occupation of Iraq, Katrina, both in terms of being unprepared in advance and the fallout, the latest financial crisis, and so on. It's really striking all that the United States was able to absorb. In some ways, I'm optimistic because of kind of where we are at the end of all of that, but that's one of the things I want to get into. But certainly, the hubris is gone, I think, and I want to first start off by asking you, Megan, when you think of what are some of the lessons of the past decade, particularly on this notion of risk and looking forward. Is one of the dangers that we're going to be too risk averse?
I think there's a great anecdote that I love about Thomas Edison. I'm not entirely sure that it's true, like most great anecdotes. But, he invented the incandescent light bulb. Electricity had already sort of become an application, but the incandescent light bulb was like the killer app of the 19th century. And it says a lot about what the media business used to be like, that the New York World had a contest for who could invent the first incandescent light bulb that wasn't an arc light, because these were extremely dangerous. And so Thomas Edison, for a bunch of reasons, wanted to be the guy. And he tried thing after thing. He wasn't actually a very good scientist. He didn't reason his way to anything. It was just like brute force. He would just try one thing after another. And having tried about 10,000 different things and still failed, the deadline of the contest was approaching. When it was about a week away, a reporter from another paper went to him in his little laboratory and said, "So how does it feel to have failed?" And he said, "What do you mean failed? I've learned 10,000 things that do not make a good filament for an incandescent light bulb." It sounds funny, but I actually think in a lot of ways that's true. When I look back at even 2 years ago, if you had asked me or any other financial journalist, could America have another Great Depression? I would have said no. We know what happened in 1930. We know how the central bank's way better than that now. There was a whole economist careers, whole academic careers were based on what's called the Great Moderation, the fact that recessions had gotten shallower, we didn't have these kinds of banking panics that we used to. Oops. And so now, in the end of it, we didn't have a Great Depression. And why? Because we reached in and we learned some quick lessons from what had happened in 1930. We did learn the lessons of 1930. We didn't do what the Fed did and contract the money supply. It turned out that wasn't enough to prevent a nasty financial crisis, but it was enough to prevent the breadlines, the total disappearance of currency from towns, banks being shut for years while passbooks traded at cents on the dollar in the secondary market because people couldn't unfreeze their assets. We avoided that. So in a lot of ways, I actually think I'm probably more hopeful than most people at the end of all this. It was in many ways a terrible decade, although great for financial writers. But when we look at it, we actually have gotten a little better. We haven't dealt with it the way we wanted to. We didn't deal with Enron the way we wanted to. We didn't go in, get the guilty parties, make sure it was never going to happen again, clean it all up, and go home in time for dinner, just like Mom would if Mom were running an economy. But we did actually it wasn't as bad. Enron was not as bad as earlier corporate failures. We had a level of transparency that was better than bigger corporate failures of earlier years that did things like take pension funds down with them and leave entire towns bankrupt. And when we had another financial crisis, we didn't have another Great Depression. We didn't even have another Panic of 1907 or Panic of 1893 or Panic of 1873. So we're getting a little better. Our failures are teaching us something, even if not everything.
But, it's interesting. Enron also just feels like so long ago. But I want to press you on that a little bit because I think one of the great shocking takeaways from the quick succession of scandals that were unveiled when the dot-com bubble burst and the whole Spitzer investigations and so forth was just how fixed and rigged the game was, and the fact that it wasn't simply a case of financial exuberance and people not knowing when to take their chips to the window and cash out. It was that the accounting firms and all of the safeguards in the system and the brokerage analysts were sending emails making jokes of the stuff that they were peddling. I mean, there was a real kind of taint to the whole system, and major accounting firm went under as a result. And I think it really was a blow to the credibility of the integrity of the system. And I'm not sure if this last financial crisis that we had, in your view, would you say that it was a similar case of the system being rigged, or was that just sort of greed and a more classic case of people forgetting about the kind of baseline assumptions about risk.
I'm actually going to take a slightly contrarian view, which is that the rigging was not the problem. It's absolutely true that, in my opinion anyway, in fact, I was an investment banking intern in the summer of 2000. I was getting my MBA. It's my fault. I was in the technology group at Merrill Lynch, actually. So I was like right at ground zero with Henry Blodgett, who subsequently got warned off and so forth. And it was clear to me even then, although not as clear as it subsequently became. I mean, I think that one of the real issues that we had then and still have now is insiders in any industry self-deal. Police officers do it, doctors do it, lawyers do it. Everyone takes care of their own at the expense of people outside. They develop norms that privilege the group over other people. Journalists do it. It is absolutely like the characteristic of groups. That's not avoidable. It's absolutely clear to me that there was a lot of self-dealing in ways that needed to be tamped down. The stuff, Frank Quattrone at CS First Boston, where they're spinning I'll do your IPO, then you get preferred shares of another IPO that I'm going to do, but that actually had nothing to do with the bubble. It didn't inflate the bubble any more than it would have already otherwise been. It was a side game, and there's a sort of accounting saying, which is that recessions reveal what auditors can't. When it all goes wrong, you get two things. You get, first of all, your cash flows aren't big enough to cover the problems anymore, which is why so many embezzlers get caught during
Bernie
recessions.
Madoff.
Yes, exactly. This is Bernie Madoff. Got revealed, nothing to do with the financial crash, except that it was no longer possible to cover up what had happened because he had too many withdrawals. And also you get disgruntled employees who get fired and then go tattle. But that's a separate issue, and I think similarly there were insider dealings with, but that wasn't why we all got stupid. The insiderism should be taken care of because, first of all, people were taking advantage of people who are dumber or just don't know, not as sophisticated as they are, right? The financial system should not be set up. There's always going to be some element of this for the same reason that like cops who do something that's sort of shady get protected and, journalists don't tell on each other, et cetera. But you want to minimize that. But that's not going to prevent us from having bubbles. That's a separate issue. Asset markets have bubbles. You can see them in a lab where students are playing for stakes in the penny range. They just happen because in an asset market, you're not just estimating what you think this thing is worth or going to be worth. You're estimating what other people think this thing is going to be worth, and what other people think it's going to be worth is actually a valid part of the price of the asset. So I think preventing those two things are both problems that we face, and especially in the last iteration that we've just had, preventing excess leverage. It's a huge, huge problem that we still really haven't even begun to address, other than the fact that no one wants to lend any money right now.
Let me just ask you one more question, and then we can shift over to Peter and then come back later. But the 90s had plenty of financial tsunamis, dislocations, most of which started in kind of in the emerging markets. You had the tequila effect when the peso went bust, and you had the Thai baht and the sort of Southeast Asian crisis, and you had Russia going into default. And back then, the U.S. was perceived to be sort of, one of the adults that came to the rescue, and you had, the Rubin and Greenspan, and we were dispensing all this great advice about how people had to live within their means. Turns out we didn't live by it the following decade. But as you look forward to this coming decade, do you think that these, global crises, whether they because of a bubble or, poor policy somewhere, do you think we will have learned our lessons and go back to being the sort of firemen in the globe, or do you think we will continue to be the source of the problem? Are we going to be part of the problem or the solution? I guess I'm asking.
Well, I mean, there are some
Clearly
people who argue that in fact the reason we're having the crisis we have now is that actually specifically Timothy Geithner muffed it when he was dealing with foreign countries in 1998. And that what his way of handling the Asia crisis made them so determined to amass massive amounts of foreign U.S. reserves that they then built up these huge pools of dollars that they poured into our mortgage markets. But do I think that we're going to? I think that yes, eventually If you look at especially like Latin America, there's a lot of pressure building up there right now in parts of Africa. Places like Venezuela, a huge oil producer, are key. When you look at Chavez taking increasingly desperate measures, trying to get his economy under some measure of control, I don't think that can end well. I think he's built a structure that was dependent on ever-rising oil prices. And who else is going to step in? Ultimately, the core issue we still have is that there is no other power on the planet right now that has, first of all, the checkbook, and second of all, the willingness to do those kinds of massive interventions. Europe doesn't have yet. They may, I mean, they're developing more integration, but they're still, the EU does not speak with one voice, and it doesn't fundraise with one voice.
But don't we run around with the Chinese checkbook?
But the Chinese are not going to go in and bail out another emerging country in the same way that the U.S. will. The U.S., I mean, I don't want to say that what we do is not self-interested, but it's not quite as like blatantly quid pro quo, I will save you now, and then you will give me all of your mineral resources.
We used to do that.
Right, but we haven't in the last, like, we're not quite that blatant as we were in the 50s. And so I think but also China has its own issues, right? Like without our economy.
Peter, I guess first of all, the title today might seem a little bit too downbeat for a Patriots fan. How many Super Bowls did you win this decade?
It's true. It was a good
3.
3 was a good decade.
And last Sunday we saw that decade is completely over.
That's true. That would be the failure part.
Yes. Talk a little bit. I know that you have a theory about perhaps American policymakers underappreciating risk, military risks, and sort of geopolitical risks as a result of a long string of victories leading up to this decade. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and where you see us as a country in our sort of comparative posture with the rest of the world. Because too often we think of things as sort of a zero-sum game. Somebody else is doing well, we must be doing poorly. But what's your view looking forward?
So the title of my forthcoming book is The Icarus Syndrome. And so what I try to suggest is the story of Icarus can help understand American foreign policy catastrophes in the sense that, Icarus gets these sets of wings from his father, and it's because they work so well, and he feels such pleasure in the ability to fly. And the ability to fly is itself an extraordinary product of his father's ingenuity and optimism about what's possible. That he loses sense of the fact that those wings are fallible. They're just wax, and that he flies too close to the sun. So that you can trace the process of the kind of the building of wings and then the flying of them ultimately too high, and then the plunge. And I think if you want to tell that story leading up to this decade, I actually think you have to start at the end of the Reagan administration, and you have to really think about Ronald Reagan, at least his foreign policy, in a very, very different way, which was that Ronald Reagan was far more cautious about the use of direct American military intervention than any of the presidents who followed him. The end of the Reagan administration is very interesting because Reagan is under pressure to invade Panama. Elliott Abrams, in particular, is leading the charge. He reappears. And the military is very resistant. And Reagan says, absolutely not. Reagan is terrified of what would happen if America tries to invade Panama. In fact, Reagan's final words in the Oval Office are, he says, I never should have sent those troops to Beirut. It's funny, because if you ask conservatives, particularly on the right today, foreign policy, what is the one thing that Ronald Reagan did bad? He never should have. He retreated in the face of terrorism after the Beirut bombings in 1983. But in fact, Reagan thought that the worst mistake he made was sending them in the first place. Reagan was highly constrained by the after effects of Vietnam. He didn't talk that way, but in fact, he was deeply, deeply influenced by the fact that America was not very far away from Vietnam. And then if you go from Panama is an enormous success and a fascinating. The parallels between Panama and Iraq are really remarkable, actually. If you talk about the way in which people predicted that everyone said, a lot of liberals said, we will never be welcomed as liberators in Panama. The Panamanians hate us. They're very nationalistic. In fact, America was welcomed as a liberator in Panama. It was very easy. And then the Gulf War, it's interesting about the Gulf War the Gulf War was much, much more influenced by the Vietnam debate than the Iraq War. Constant invocation of Vietnam and the fears of this would be another Vietnam in 1990 and 1991, and not only amongst liberals. If you go back and think of to some of the people we think of as the most prominent hawks of today, you look at what they said about the Gulf War, you see the way, how much more cautious they were. So John McCain said about the Gulf War, before he ultimately voted for it, he said for a long time during the run-up, I am against sending any ground troops to Kuwait. We will lose vast numbers of lives. All I will support is air power. And then John McCain, in fact, opposed American intervention in Bosnia for many, many years on the same logic, the Colin Powell logic, that basically we couldn't get involved in these kind of wars. It was far too risky. And you see with person after person over the course of the 90s, the gradual willingness to take on more and more risk, greater and greater self-confidence in the American military, the power of the American military to defeat its enemies without spending very much money. We turn a profit on the Gulf War, and without losing very many lives. We lose not many lives in the Gulf War, and then in Bosnia, and then in Kosovo. And I think all of this creates a kind of a pressure that ultimately leads to disaster with the Iraq War in 2003. Again, the early part of Afghanistan also producing that greater and greater self-confidence, the ease with which we overthrow the Taliban. And now it seems to me the very, very difficult moment that Barack Obama finds himself in is realizing that the military tool is much more difficult to wield than his predecessors thought. Even if you think about the rise of counterinsurgency theory, on the one hand, you can look at that as a real success story of the kind that Megan is talking about. We learned, right? We were dumb when we went into invade Iraq. We became much smarter. There's no question about it. The military has learned, an enormous amount. A lot of very, very smart people have figured out much better how to fight counterinsurgency wars than we knew in 2003. So on the one hand, it's a success story of failure and learning from failure. On the other hand, what the counterinsurgency people tell us is that if we invest vast amounts of resources and are willing to, for over many, many, many years, and are willing to lose quite substantial numbers of lives, then we can quite possibly gradually create governments and political environments in a place like Iraq and Afghanistan, which will still be far less than we thought we were going to be able to create. If you listen to David Petraeus, it is really the opposite of hubris. What he's telling America is that basically, if you're willing to invest massively, we can have outcomes that will still be far less optimal than George W. Bush was selling us on the eve of the Iraq War. And I think that's the kind of new sobriety that characterizes the debate that America is having about Afghanistan. And I think it's a much more difficult environment in which to be president of the United States than it was. But I think it is a sign of a kind of a new realism about American power that's valuable.
You do see sort of a reset of expectations across the board. In terms of these wars, it's now you have your president telling you not that he's looked into the soul of the Afghan president, decided that he's the Thomas Jefferson of that part of the world, but it's he's a scoundrel and all, but we have to support him. And in the financial world too, it's people are back to thinking that, geez, if I can get a 10% return this year, that's pretty good. And savings accounts are paying like 1%. One thing I'd like for both of you to react to is whether we're just being too provincial, and even categorizing this as a terrible decade. The argument has been made, and it's a compelling argument, that for much of the world, it was a tremendously positive time. And in the long term, this might not be necessarily to America's disadvantage. Our stock market's down for the decade. In Latin America, I grew up in Mexico, we used to talk about lost decades, and certainly the United States has had one in terms of stock markets and individual income. But, when you think of what's happened in countries like Brazil and China and India and, almost all parts of the world, there's been stable growth, which is a real novelty. So I don't know. Were these the best of times when you look to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think if you want to make an optimistic case, I think one of the things you can say, and I'll let Megan talk a little more about the economic front, but on the political front, you can say that the obituaries of Francis Fukuyama and his end of history argument have been written a little bit too quickly. We know that waves of democratization tend to be followed by retrenchments. And there have been a fair number of people who've written about a kind of a retrenchment of democratization of democracy in certain parts of the world. But if you really, that retrenchment of, in Russia would be a natural example, or in Venezuela, for instance, other places in very weak democratic governments in the Philippines or in Thailand or Bangladesh. But if you compare it to the other retrenchments, say the massive fall of democracies in the most powerful countries in the world in the 1920s and 30s, for instance, this retrenchment hasn't been that bad by historical comparison. And it's clear that there is still some real momentum and power. There are big dominoes that could still fall in terms of countries in big important countries like Iran in critical parts of the world that still could create much more liberal political systems than they have now. And that there has not really emerged a real ideological challenge to liberal democracy, even with the great problems that the United States has had, even as the American model, which people were so triumphant about at the end of the 1990s, has started to look less attractive. If there is an ideological competitor, it's nowhere near the kind of level of the ideological competitors that America had, let's say, between the 1920s and the 1940s or 1950s. You have jihadist Islam, which is not a model, which has a certain amount of support because people like punching America in the nose, but nobody really wants to live under that as a political system, and nobody in their right mind believes, as they believed about fascism, communism, that they could produce greater prosperity than could democracy. And even if you look at China, and I'm not a China expert, but it strikes me that China, that even the Chinese say basically we want to be democratic eventually. We're just saying it's going to take us a very, very long period of time. We want to do it in a very careful way, and we don't want our democracy to look quite as anarchic as yours. But it's not really a universal ideological challenge to liberal democracy of the kind that fascism and communism were at their height. And so in that sense, that the Fukuyama idea still has some power and still may be proven more right than wrong. And I think that is a cause for a certain kind of optimism, even as American power may be in relative decline.
I actually want to argue that I'm not sure that American economic power is in relative decline. I mean, if you look at, we are very provincial about this. We talk about this as being an American-caused financial crisis, and it's all about America. We're doing relatively well compared to, say, Europe. We're doing relatively well compared to most of the rest of the world. And I would attribute that to the American financial system is pretty resilient, and we're a large country and we have a lot going on. So even when our auto sector fails, our financial system isn't doing so well, and our real estate sector is in big trouble, we've got a lot of other industries. You compare that with a place like Finland, where their GDP, like Nokia, actually makes a measurable impact on their GDP, one company. So I think when you look outside the rest of the United States, it's even more apparent. I mean, China, Brazil, almost anywhere that you look. It's hard to name a country besides Zimbabwe that's really just noticeably declined over the last 10 years. That's really, and even in America, we talk about the stock market's down. Well, the stock market was at a ridiculous level. So it's saying it's down. It's down from where it was.
Are they still there? Yeah.
Doesn't worry me that much. But also, I have to say, when you look at I think a lot of the advances in people's lives are harder to quantify. But I have a job that didn't exist 10 years ago. I started blogging and got a job in journalism. That wasn't an avenue to do 10 years ago. There are a lot of people like that. I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people who have jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago. They're better than the jobs that they replaced.
But aren't median incomes in the States, haven't they been flat, if
It's
not down?
complicated because a lot of that has gone into healthcare. And if you ask the reinsurance industry, where are the high cost claims? They're 1 million plus claims. Those are the big claims where they see a lot of the growth. What is it? Cardiovascular, cancer, organ transplants, and premature babies. Obviously, there are medical ethics debates about how aggressively we should intervene at the end of life and with very premature infants. But I would say that in general, to the extent that the parents want those babies saved, the children want those parents saved, that's not an unalloyed bad. If you look at Dwight Eisenhower, when he had a heart attack in 1955, he got the state-of-the-art medical treatment. It was absolutely the finest medical treatment money could buy. It was bed rest and painkillers and rat poison. That was what you had for a heart attack in 1955. Now we've got 5 different ways to open your vessels. We've got protocols that have reduced the death from myocardial infarction within the first 2 hours of arriving in the emergency room dramatically. We've actually made, but you can't measure it, right? If I'm not having a heart attack, I don't think to myself, but I have the option of having a heart attack and not dying. It doesn't feel real. And when you do have that heart attack, you don't think, that's what I gave up all those wages for. It's hard to measure those things, but there have been noticeable, huge improvements in quality of life. We are living longer. Active life expectancy, which is the healthy part of your life, is increasing faster than average life expectancy. So our period of senescence is actually shortening. American lives are getting better. They're just not necessarily getting better in ways that we're very good at measuring.
But that's different than relative decline vis-a-vis other powers, isn't it?
But if you look at, so China's growing fast, but it's a big economy. But in an economy where so many people are still so poor, you don't have a lot of surplus generated to having relative power. And Europe is mostly growing slower than we are. So they're starting at a lower level. And whereas it used to be the standard theory that you had convergence, we're not converging. We're very slowly pulling away from them. So they're basically growing just by glomming on more countries to Europe. But those countries, again, like with the China problem, they have less surplus because they're much poorer countries. I don't see yet. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, and I personally think it would be great because it would mean there would be richer, more democratic, happier people in the world. But right now, I don't actually see that the United States is in relative decline. We're still the biggest, richest country in the world.
Well, I think there's no question that in some of these developing countries, it was a far more positive decade in terms of life getting measurably better. The things that you can measure, the economy.
Yes.
Now, you're right. It's easier depending on if your baseline is $1,000 per capita income. It's easier to double that and triple that than it is once you're fully a developed country. So in that sense, you could argue that, and we had the headlines yesterday that China becomes the largest exporter in the world, overtaking Germany, and they now have the largest auto industry or auto market, overtaking the U.S. These are the kinds of things that one would expect over time. I suppose in some sense it is a slide in our relative standing, but I'm struck by something Peter said, and I unfortunately agree because it'd be nice if we disagreed on something, that all of this, one of the great takeaways and fallouts of the latest crisis was that the G7 was expanded to the G20. There was a sense that you have all of these countries that for once have acted very responsibly. We're not part of they didn't trigger this crisis, and they're important stakeholders, so they deserve a place at the table to address global financial crises. So the G7 expands to the G20, and you have countries like Brazil and India and China now having more of a say. There's more representation. But to Peter's point, it's not like they're really there to advocate some radical alternative to the way the global game is, the rules of the game. They're basically there to kind of have a say on sort of the American system. There aren't these competing isms like you pointed out. For all the knocks to our credibility that we took, as I started off with, when you go down the list, it's just kind of amazing that anybody wants to sort of play in our sandbox anymore.
Well, in a way, it's also, if you were to think about where the ideological fissures are, I think you could tell a story in which, interestingly, America is halfway in between China and India on the one hand and Europe on the other, which is a sense that, if you want to think about where the ideological divisions are, because everybody basically, one story you could tell is that it's about sovereignty, right? That you have some countries that are basically pretty invested in a kind of post-sovereignty agenda, a set of international legal institutions and norms that are basically going to require certain things of various other countries, and other countries that are very hostile to that. And what's interesting there, you can see it in the Copenhagen on climate change in particular, America is actually somewhere in between. It's China. And China and India are more jealous of their sovereignty than we are, but the Europeans are less jealous of their sovereignty. We have this huge divide, basically, this huge kind of red-blue divide, which has been true for much of our history, basically. On the one hand, a country that desires to create and be at the forefront of kind of the creation of a more institutionalized international order. On the other hand, a country that is very, very jealous of its sovereignty, much more jealous than the countries of Europe. So in a weird way, I think it's a kind of interesting creative position that the way that China and India are pushing, which is towards maybe a less regulated international system, are actually kind of congenial to the way that red state America wants to think about the international system, which is that they view it as always going to be Hobbesian, and they're comfortable with understanding as a kind of Hobbesian place.
Yeah, it's interesting that those countries, the BRIC countries, Brazil and India and China, they're very savvy now at playing it both ways. They want to be part of the G20. They want to be in the rooms where decisions are made, but they want to be able to opt out and still say, well, we need a license to catch up to you. So you guys need to fix these transnational problems, but let us pollute until we get to your level of, or whatever the issue is.
I think the interesting thing for me that emerged, because I reported on trade quite a bit when I was at The Economist, and obviously we've seen this before. What happened at Copenhagen is in many ways a replay of what happened at Doha. Basically, the G97, by the time they were done, it was huge numbers of developing countries banded together and said no more. No financial services liberalization, certainly none until you liberalize your agriculture. And we were also in the middle. We said we would do it, and Europe kind of went, no way. I think that for someone who mostly I guess I'm like red state America. I mostly like sovereignty. I'm happy to see China, not because I would be happy to see some sort of global cap and trade regime, but I'm glad to see them emerging and not sort of simply allowing the United States and Europe to decide what's going to happen and then just buy off the relevant developing countries. But that said, that means I think that for certainly the next 20 years, we're looking at a lot less. I don't think we can get anything done multilaterally because, in fact, there's too many of them, and they don't really have a coalition other than you should give us more money. Especially in a time when governments are increasingly going to be cash-strapped with their entitlements and their demographics. I don't see any advancement on trade, on the environment, on any of the sort of major multilateral issues that I think certainly when Obama came in, a lot of people were expecting.
Yeah, but that is a story of, the story of decline is always about where you set the benchmark. So in some ways you can always rig it depending on what you're comparing it to. But if you want to compare that to 1945, that is a story of massive relative decline in the sense that when we created the institutional order that we now live with, the UN and the IMF and the World Bank and what became WTO and NATO, those countries weren't even countries, many of them. They had no power at all. At China, we basically put on the UN Security Council. Brilliantly, FDR decided it would be a good idea because he imagined they could have power in the future, and we created this international order basically with the Europeans and kind of pushed it through. So it is a story, it's probably an inevitable story, but it is a story of a redistribution of international power.
But I feel like comparing it to 1945 when we had the only functioning industrial economy in the world and had invaded large swaths of Europe.
Yeah, but I'm saying you can compare it to 1960 or even 1970 or 1980, and that you would still find that same trajectory in terms of power of the developing world versus power of North America and Europe.
Possibly. I would say we're trying to do more than we used to, right? Basically what we wanted to do back then was put missiles in their countries, and then we would give them money and they would let us put missiles in their countries. I mean, we didn't have much of a multilateral agenda that we actually needed consent for. We needed consent from individual countries, but we didn't have these global collective action problems that we were trying to solve. So I'm not real sure that if you went back to 1960, there would have been a global cap and trade regime either. I mean, I think maybe back then they would have signed on for it and then they just would have not done it. But I'm not sure that
we also would deposed regimes with relative ease back at that point. I mean, you could basically send in this CIA and overthrow governments, and people in Congress barely knew.
You could get away with a lot more back then. I want to make a pitch to an article that was in our neighbor is Foreign Policy magazine upstairs, and to Megan's point about the Doha round and the role that these emerging countries play, there's a brilliant argument in there in the latest issue of Foreign Policy by Barbara Crosette, who was a New York Times correspondent for many years, where she's arguing that India is just basically a huge obstacle to a lot of progress on any number of fronts. And it was a really interesting argument because we don't often think of India's global role that way. But we're getting awfully wonky here, despite in violation of Steve Call's invocation. So I want to quickly shift gears, and we're going to spend another 10 minutes or so, and then hit the drinks, and I want everybody to socialize. I apologize in advance. I think everybody in this room would have something interesting to say about the last decade, and let's talk amongst ourselves and let's interact. So I don't want to take up too much. I don't want to take up time with questions and reactions because the fact that we do have an open bar. But I want to shift gears for the last 10 minutes and kind of see if we have some theories about what happened in the popular culture and the way in which people really live. And when you think about the last decade and the sort of advent of reality TV and the kind of removal of intermediaries in so many aspects of our lives and the way that we engage information and content, and those of us who are exiles from the world, old media worlds, or have seen the downside of this, but it's been a very empowering time for individuals who can now basically be their own broadcasters and editors on Facebook and by tweeting and so forth. So Megan, do you have an all-encompassing theory about what's happened to popular culture in the last decade? And if not, can you come up with one right here?
My goodness. I think that the intermediaries between we've stopped, looking up at other people who were broadcasting content out, and we've just started increasingly almost gazing at our own navels. I was just talking today about Google Trends, which is this fascinating software from Google that allows you to look at searches, and you can actually see like real-time trends in things like diseases. They actually, epidemiologists can use it to track the flu by looking up how many people are searching for flu symptoms. But it's a little creepy, and it's not creepy because there's any individual information attached to it. It's more because suddenly, we used to worry about people looking at us, and now it's like we can sort of look into the dark night of our collective psyche. The thing that's been circulating the internet today and for the last couple of days is the difference between the searches on my girlfriend is, how do I get my girlfriend to, and how do I get my boyfriend to, what Google suggests. The differences between the top one from girlfriend is propose, for boyfriend is propose, top one for girlfriend I will not repeat in mixed company.
Oh, come on, this is off the record.
But
Forget about the camera.
Fascinating. The only thing those two lists share is how do I get my girlfriend or boyfriend to love me again, and they're just about the same level. But as a blogger, I participated in this kind of disintermediation, and I think in general it's been really great. But I think one of the things that hasn't been so great for media has been actually people. A lot of journalists talk about it as if it's a contest between bloggers and journalists for eyeballs, and it's not. It's a contest between our ad department and Craigslist for advertising, and we're losing. And so you're also seeing it in TV. And so what we're getting is cheaper and cheaper user-generated content to go into the R-rated. So apparently, amateur porn is killing off the professional version. People are willing to put videos of themselves on the internet for free. Who knew? So
once again, quality is suffering. There's no standards anymore.
But actually,
there's a different version of American Idol.
But this is the interesting thing, and this actually goes to something that Michael Kinsley wrote in this month's Atlantic. What do we define as quality? And the reason that people say they like amateur porn is that it doesn't feel hard and unemotional and produced. It's real people who like each other, and that's actually that's an element of quality. But similarly for bloggers, people like knowing that it's not a professional who is sitting up on their pedestal simply delivering. It's a person. They're having actually, in a lot of ways, a more intimate relationship with a human being who may also deliver to them the latest awesome foreign policy news. And so in that way, is that a bad thing? Those relationships that people are forming with reading. I got my first wedding, I'm getting married in June, and the first wedding gift I got was from, I didn't announce my registry anywhere. one of my commenters and readers found my wedding registry at Crate and Barrel and sent me something, and he's been commenting on my website for
That's
like 10
kind of
years.
freaky.
Well, but it would be. But he's been reading me since 2002. He comments. I know his name. We've emailed. Like, it would be a little creepy, but he's a married guy living in Indiana, and it was like a nice, and it's a salad bowl. I mean, it's. But like people are forming more intense relationships with their content, even as like what the professionals who were pronouncing it in old media and I and everyone else deride as like low quality. It has other qualities, and those qualities are valuable. I think human relationships are valuable, and creating a bigger feeling of that. That's a good change in the population. Not all of the changes are good, but some of that exists in reality TV. Some of that, I think some of those changes actually do mirror this hunger for authentic connection with another human being. Obviously, reality TV is really processed or whatever, but that is what it's mirroring, is that maybe because we live in more anonymous communities, whatever, we want a connection with another human being who's a real person and not just an actor who's been hired to deliver something to us.
Peter, do you get gifts from Daily Beast?
And sadly, no. I mean, I think that's really true, and yet I also think it produces in some way the opposite response too. I mean, which is to say, the more democratized these things become, and the more you don't have the old gatekeepers who could say, this you have the right to know about, this you don't have the right to know about. The more I think that also there is a deep hunger that people have for authority and to not actually have the freedom to choose anything. I mean, that's also a feature of the human personality is not wanting the right to choose, being told what's right and what's wrong. I mean, so and I think that dialectic is always playing itself out. So on the one hand, you have a world in which people have more and more radical free choice, and yet people are drawn in every religion to the more neo-orthodox forms of that religion, which basically limit your choice and tell you, no, from on high, ex cathedra, this is the way it is. Get in line, and people flock to that. They don't want the choice. They don't want to have to. They don't want to have to figure out what's right. They want someone who is invested in authority. And it seems to me, I always think about which of those institutions that have the power in a particular given room to demand that people turn off all their technology. It seems to me, it's interesting because I just started teaching at a university in the fall, and I asked friends of mine who were teaching, and they all said, well, the great dilemma is, what do you do about students who are basically on email or on the web all the time? And it's really a question about how you try to exercise authority. But in a weird way, it's actually the professors who are most willing to take the hardest line and say, if you want to have a connection to me, I demand, or simultaneously the religious institutions that basically make those demands and invoke authority in the most rigid terms and the most undiluted terms that actually are doing the best. So I think I think everything Megan is saying is exactly right, and yet in a certain kind of way it produces a kind of its opposite too.
So what do? You tell people to take away their cell phones?
I'm a liberal, so I have a naturally an anti-authoritarian streak, and so I was convinced by my friends that if you're actually a really good teacher, it forces you to raise your game, because basically you have to just remind yourself that if you're a good enough teacher and engaging enough, then they will naturally, without coercive brute force, they will not surf the web because they'll be so engaged in what you're saying. So we'll see how that works out.
I have to say, apparently the libertarian answer is to memorize the class list and randomly call on people while not looking at them, forcing them to pay attention to you at all times or be incredibly embarrassed.
So which of all the technologies that we adopted this decade, and it's a little, I was thinking earlier and talking to some people about, well, when exactly did we start using X or Y, or clearly the social networking stuff started this past decade, and Twitter, but I mean, what do you think is going to be the most lasting legacy of the aughts in terms of the things that we interact with? I mean, I guess we were using Google already prior to
Google existed.
time.
Well, no, actually, that's not true, because I had a friend in business school who interviewed with this tiny company no one had ever heard of that was doing search. She would have been like the 8th employee, and she was like, "Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's going to work."
You should go to Enron instead.
No, she's home with a kid in California. But I think, search was there, and Google
changed a lot, but we were already searching the web using algorithms. There was already Alta Vista and so forth. I think that I want to say the Twitter, but this may only be because that happens to be the latest thing that I'm now have to satisfy my Twitter followers by tweeting 5 or 10 times a day. But I think actually to pitch my own thing, I think I would put either blogs, because they did so much. They were the first thing that then followed this tumble of disintermediation, and sort of build your own content and substituting out analysis or opinion for hard news. Or the iPhone, the smartphones in general. This sense of never being. I remember when my first friend got an iPhone, and I started saying to him, if you keep using that while I am talking to you, I am not meeting you for drinks anymore, because I can't sit here while you read box scores. And now we all sit there and read box scores, so we don't have to interact at all. And I actually think that this is I was watching a movie with my fiance last night, and he couldn't stop. He was reading the biography of Montgomery Clift, every film he'd been in, what the director was doing. And it's totally changed these little social interactions in a way that technology didn't intrude into. I will close with one anecdote. I was talking to a friend's younger brother who's 23. I was talking about when I was in college back in the 90s, ages ago. But the early 90s, I'd never had an email account. And when I was a freshman, there was this thing about when Lent ended. And we had this, we're like Aristotle. We're deriving it from first principles. This debate raged all week because obviously we all wanted it to end as quickly as possible so we could eat whatever it was we'd given up. But we didn't know, so we all ended up going till Sunday. And then we got to church on Sunday and found out that in fact ended on Thursday. So we were all extremely upset. And he's just staring at me, as many of the young people in this audience are, in total blank incomprehension. And I had to say, there was no Google. Right? There was no way to find out except going to a priest and asking him when Lent ended, or going to the library and looking it up. And none of us were motivated to do either of those two things. But this ability to have those dorm room arguments that went on for 90 years about things that just trying to derive facts from first principles.
The problem is you can settle them now.
Yeah, but I mean that's actually kind of sad. There's we've lost something when we no longer we don't when there's always information at a glance. So my fiance wasn't watching the damn movie. He was too busy learning about Montgomery Clift from other people who had watched the movie. And this is, I actually think, a big change in the way that we do things.
Well, it's funny. One reason why we have a forecasting contest was because we'd also discussed having a trivia quiz about the decade that was. But to Megan's point, I thought, well, everybody nowadays has all the answers. I mean, if it's anything having to do with trivia and past history, we're all empowered to look it up on the spot. So I thought, let's look forward. So, but anyways, thank you all for coming, and please stick around. We have another hour to socialize and have cocktails and share our reminiscences about the decade that was and looking forward. And I wish all of you a happy New Year. Thank you. We're going to talk amongst ourselves.
I'm sorry, Peter. I think I took up all your time.
That's all right. No.